foreign kid in a Japanese school uniform, which is already a bit incongruous to local people. And I'm sprinting out of the station. I like hit my card as I'm leaving, and I'm sprinting down the streets, like past traffic. And I make it to the school after about a few minutes, but the assembly has already started. And so I come in to effectively a silent room besides the principal speaking. And hundreds of heads turn over to look at me as I open up the door.
Staying motivated takes work. If you don't work on your motivation, you become unmotivated. Join Noah Dieng as he shares inspirational stories and tips to get you motivated to do whatever you need to do. This is the Motivational Voice Podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Motivational Voice Podcast. This is session number 31. Hey, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you here. If you've ever wondered what it would feel like to live in a foreign country, or the thought of living in a foreign country has crossed your mind, but you are too nervous to take the next step, today's episode is a treat. Some of the most rewarding experiences in my life happened because I immersed myself into a foreign culture for an extended period of time, or just took a trip to another country that put me outside of my comfort zone. Today's podcast is very special to me because I am sharing a conversation that I had with someone who I care about a lot, my 19-year-old son, Noah. Noah spent time in Japan earlier this year as part of a student exchange program where he had to learn to navigate some interesting challenges. Now, I did not have him on the podcast because he is related to me, but because I believe that he has stories that are not only entertaining, but are full of useful anecdotes for anyone who is thinking about going abroad to work or to study. So without further ado, let's listen to my interview with Noah. Noah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for doing this. I've been chasing you around for months.
It's been a while. I've been home like 6 months now, I think.
Yeah, trying to get you to do the recording. Now, I know you, but my listeners don't know you.
Yes.
Can you introduce yourself and tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I can. I'm Noah. I am on this podcast because I spent my senior year of high school in Osaka, Japan. As far as I go personally, I'm 18. I was raised primarily in Minnesota, the state of 10,000 lakes here. And just graduated high school this year, in spite of the pandemic situation. So it's been an interesting year to be back.
So I have you on because I think people who may be thinking about maybe going abroad to study or even to work, especially other countries, may have some good tips to get out of your experiences, even though you're young.
Yeah.
So you went to Japan. Let's take a step back. Why did you go to Japan in the first place?
So for me, I think a lot of people go into foreign exchange with the mindset of like, a lot of people have been interested in it since they were a child. And they're thinking like, man, I've always wanted to travel. I've always wanted to see other cultures. But for me, it started primarily because I was bored, which sounds shallow.
You were bored.
But I was like, I was one of those people in high school where a lot of my friends were in the grades above me. And so I realized as I was finishing up my junior year, like halfway through it, that when I graduated to senior year, I wasn't going to have any friends. So I was like, well, I just started learning Japanese in school, and I'm not going to have any friends next year. So why not use my Japanese? So then, just entirely on a whim, I looked into exchange programs, and on the absolute last day of the deadline for the program I applied to, I just put in an application just on a whim. And somehow I got in. So for me, I guess the starting thing was like, I don't know what I'm doing senior year, so I'm just going to go.
Yeah, that speak about on a whim, because all of a sudden your mother and I were approached by you, and all of a sudden you were like, I want to go to Japan. We were like, what? You want to go to Japan? And so your thought process was that would give you something to do, or did you have a prior interest of wanting to visit another culture or anything like that?
Yeah, I think, well, because, I have kind of always been interested in Japanese media. I think a lot of kids in America are exposed to Japanese media, whether it's like Dragon Ball or Naruto or something as kids. And so, I watched those shows when I was a kid, and so I'd always had like at least a passing interest in Japanese culture. So I think that's probably why it clicked in my head to go there at all. Between that and the fact that I had just started studying Japanese in school, I guess I've always been interested in travel. It had just never struck me as something that I could do until kind of those things all meshed together in that moment.
Right. And I think, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe influences that I or your mom may have had on you wanting to go abroad.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back. So you decided that you wanted to go to Japan, and what was the next steps? What are some of the things that we did in terms of trying to figure out how to take you there?
Yeah. So as far as, I think really the most difficult step to going on a foreign exchange is finding out about it. I think there are plenty of people that would be interested in going to other countries that literally just don't realize that the opportunity is out there. I certainly didn't. I had never thought about it until, my junior year of high school. And you can just Google it, like foreign exchange to whatever country, and there are a million international organizations. I ended up going with Rotary primarily because foreign exchange can be expensive. And Rotary offers exchange for like half the price of any company out there, whether it's like AFS or kind of any America-based company that I know of, at least. And so,
yeah, and I think, about that, I think for us, the money was a factor in that we didn't want to spend 15, 20 grand on a program. First of all, affordability was a question, but it still was $6,000 that we had to figure out how to. We were like, we're not gonna give you $6,000 so you can go to Japan.
Yeah, totally.
So what are some of the things? How did you come out? How did we manage to get the money? What are some of the things that we did?
So as far as the money went, because I knew, I had gotten into it pretty late in the game. Like I said, I applied on the last day possible. So for me, there was no I'm going to work and then save up for this. I had maybe a few months until the first payment would have been due. And I wasn't working that much. I was working maybe 8 to 10 hours a week at that point. And I had a weird job that didn't really allow me to expand past that. And so my savings would not have been able to pay for much of it alone. And so what I did, and this is what all the kids do these days, I created a GoFundMe, and I sent it I put together this video just of me talking about kind of what I wanted to do. Just to, see if it got a reaction, because I had no idea whether or not it would be successful at all, but I figured I'd try since it was just about the only way I was going to get there. So I put up that video on GoFundMe. I got some help from my very kind mother putting it together, and we sent it around to kind of the extended family, friends, and just to see, if anybody was interested in contributing anything.
Right.
And that, I mean, really, for lack of a better word, it kind of blew up among my family and friends.
Yeah, I think that was crucial. I think we put a lot of thought. Both your mom and I kind of talked about how we would craft the message, because we wanted to make sure that if people donated to the GoFundMe, that they knew that their money was going towards a worthy cause.
Yeah.
And I think between her and I, we kind of sent it out to our contacts, our friends, Facebook primarily, and you're right that it blew up over there. We got to give thanks and credit to all of those who actually donated to your GoFundMe. We got a lot of donations from people who were willing to support and were very, very kind, and we're thankful for that. And I think I wanted to make sure that people understand that it wasn't just really about getting the GoFundMe going. It was more, I think, about, because we could have kind of found the money, given you the money, to be honest, but it was more about, we wanted to teach you some values around, if you want something that has a high price tag, you have to be willing to put in the work for us to be able to assist you. And I think something we said, if you could find a portion of the money, we would help you find the rest of the money, or we would put in the rest of the money.
Yeah.
And certainly that was one of the core main reasons why we did that. Now, you talked about having to make a first payment to Rotary. So to give a little bit of background, you had to do these orientations for before you went to the trip.
Yeah.
So there were 3 orientations that you had to do through this organization, Rotary, and I'll put some of the links for them into the show notes for the episode. But anyway, can you talk a little more about that? How did that go, and what was the experience of going to those first orientations, quote unquote?
Yeah. Well, and, even before the orientations, there was like a brief interview process where they kind of screen you and your parents, and it was pretty light. And then, so going into the orientation, how at least my local Rotary district structures it, because they're an international organization, and it kind of varies depending on where you are. How my organization did it was they had 3 orientations. And then at each of those orientations, a certain amount of the total payment was due. I believe it was $2,000 per orientation, so it totals up to $6,000. And the first orientation, a lot of it is just, it's kind of, the point of the orientations is obviously to prepare you for going abroad. And so the first one is kind of to familiarize you with Rotary themselves, kind of the leadership structure of everything, how going to different countries has different officers overseeing it, and to get you familiar with who's going to be keeping track of you when you're abroad for all those months.
Right.
And then also to kind of introduce you and kind of do a little bit of community building with all the other exchange students, because that's a very big part of what Rotary does. They really like to connect their students, even students going to different locations, and make sure there's kind of like a familial bond there. So that was kind of the first orientation, a lot of socializing and a lot of just kind of understanding the organization behind the exchange itself. So it's a few months in between each orientation. I believe it was in about September or October, the first one, and then the next one was in around December, I believe. And the second one is kind of the peak of socialization as far as the orientations go. There's, I believe, a brief kind of family section where they go over some more details like homesickness and culture shock and kind of ways to deal with that kind of stuff. They cover a lot of kind of coping mechanisms for the stuff that you could go with abroad. And following that, it was a like this overnight trip to this YMCA camp, like out kind of in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. And so they, I should mention one thing Rotary does is that they bring together the students who are leaving the country, known as the outbounds, and then the students who are currently living from abroad in wherever your area is. So in my case, the students living in Minnesota.
How was that? How was it to be exposed to other kids from other countries and other places?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of great all around. Like, one of the first realizations that you come to, I guess, as a teenager going into youth exchange is that I think on a conscious level, people know that teenagers all over the world are all going to be teenagers, and that they all, they're all, for lack of a better term, kind of the same. Like, they all act like teenagers, regardless of where you're from. But kind of to feel that in person was different. Like, to get to know this Norwegian girl and this Danish guy and this South African, and it's like, we're all, obviously their levels of English and everything vary and there are cultural differences, but the first thing I came to the realization of was that we're all totally just teenagers winging it, and nobody really knows what they're doing here. We're all just kids, basically. And so it was really nice to talk to people and kind of come to that understanding that, like, I felt like I didn't know what I was doing with exchange. And then I realized that the people living in America from other countries didn't know what they were doing either. So it was kind of this mutual understanding of, like, I'm 17, you're 17, and we're both equally confused about what's going on.
Yeah, that it's interesting to get your perspective, because as parents, we went to these orientations, and for the most part, we were in a different room where we were separated from from you guys, from the kids going to the programs. And I think these orientations were also partly to manage parents.
Yeah.
Because if your child, for most parents, it's your child is the one thing you love the most in the world, maybe aside from your spouse, is going to go abroad. And parents are starting to have palpitations about the idea that your child is going to go abroad. And in your case, it was like for a year.
Yeah.
And in Japan, so it's not like we could just get you on the phone and and jump and be there if you had a problem.
Yeah.
So anyway, the idea was, I think these orientations were mostly to manage the parents' expectations and not to get the parents not to freak out if something happens, or jump on the next plane, and be there the next morning when something happened. But anyway, it was interesting to get your perspective as well on that. Now, I want to talk about the actual experience of being in Japan and the whole process of actually going to Japan. So you are in the plane, your first solo, I believe, international flight into Asia. You've gone to Africa with me and your brothers in the past, but that was different. But this is the first time you fly international. You land in Japan. What is it like? What are you feeling? What are you seeing? What happened?
Yeah, so I should say on the plane, a lot of people freak out on the plane. Like, they leave their family at the airport, they get on the plane, and then they realize, oh no, I can't go back now.
This is real.
Yeah. For me, it didn't hit on the plane, and I was in the longest flight of my life. I believe it was like 2 hours to Seattle or so, and then 11 hours to Japan. And it didn't hit me on the flight. I was watching like Marvel movies, animated movie. I was sitting there like chilling. I got off the plane and I go to the baggage claim. I'm there with another exchange student. There was somebody else, a guy that I know, Oscar, who was headed to the same place as me. And we get in this line that leads up to kind of, I guess, customs. We don't have our bags yet because we haven't made it to the baggage claim. And there's these like 3 lines that lead to different places in customs. And there is English in the airport. Mm-hmm. But it's really, the lines are so mixed up that nobody knows where they're supposed to be going. So we just get into 2 random lines. And I think we were in the wrong lines because I noticed there was a lot of Asian people, and I'm not Asian in those lines. And then kind of an airport employee came over and said something to me, and he like led me over to another line. And eventually I got to this kind of the customs officer, I suppose, and I, showed him my passport, ran everything, and I got through. And Oscar, the guy there with me, was stuck at that line for like 25 minutes. There was some misunderstanding.
The line with the Asian Americans?
He made it to the same line as me, but something with the customs officer just wasn't going through. And so I was standing outside there waiting, like, should I go to the baggage claim? Should I leave him behind? And he was stuck there that whole time. So I'm waiting.
And Oscar is someone you knew who was also in the Rotary program, going to Japan, and you guys had made a friendship over these orientations and became buds.
Yeah, we knew each other pretty decently well at that point. And I didn't want to just leave him behind, even though I knew my host family was waiting for me out there. So I wait. And eventually he comes out, and I'm super relieved because I wasn't sure if he was getting like arrested or something. And we get our bags. We head out, and there's this big kind of open room. There's Japanese all over the signs everywhere. And I'm like, wow, this is Japan. Yeah. And there's this huge crowd of like Japanese people I've never met before. And they're carrying like signs that say like, welcome to Japan. And I was like, my God, this is how they do it in the movies. I'm in Japan. They're welcoming me and everything was great.
Were the signs in English or in
It was written in English, yeah.
Okay.
And so it was apparently, because I didn't understand this at the time because I'd never seen these people. I got remarkably little information about my host families before I went there. Because what Rotary has you do is switch between a few different host families over the course of the year. And I had known about my first one. I had seen pictures of them, but I didn't know the second, the third, and there was going to be a fourth. And so I see my first host family, and it's just a huge crowd of people, Rotary businessmen, kind of the local leadership, and then my host family. And then there were my other host families kind of lined up with them. And so we go out, we're greeted by all these people, we're shaking hands, bowing, which is new to us. And it was this huge kind of thing, and everybody's saying stuff, and I'm using my limited Japanese to converse.
How good was your Japanese at this point?
It was poor. I had poor Japanese when I got there. I would say very poor.
Well, I mean, you were taking Japanese before leaving. You did. Yeah. Rotary sends out a number of courses. I think it was you had to take 30 courses before you actually go abroad, so you're at least conversational or close to being able to say what you need.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
And I had been studying for about a year at that point, kind of self-study for most of it, and I thought I was pretty good before I was going there, and then I got there and I realized I don't know what these people are saying. It's way more complicated than people think with languages like that are super different. I think I could have nailed down Spanish or French or something in that time, but not an Asian, like an East Asian language.
Yeah. And you actually, just a quick point on that. When you came back from Japan, which I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, some of the things you said resonated with me because I learned English. I wasn't born a native English speaker.
Yeah.
I actually was born and raised in Africa, where the system is French. Mm-hmm. So I learned French in school, and when I was in high school, I started learning a little bit of English. This was actually, I didn't become fluent in English until my early 20s. Yeah. And I was okay. My English was better than your mom's French when we met. But you said something that you came to the realization that, wow, there's a lot that goes into learning another language, living in another country where you weren't born, learning to speak the language and communicate and actually be working in that language. Yeah. And I think that was, a point of connection and that I sensed between the two of us, that was a result of your experience, a direct result of your experience going to Japan, right? So continue.
Yeah, so we're there, we're kind of meeting our host families and taking pictures with people that I've never seen before, and it's all this big event. And, it was very welcoming. I know in some countries, you barely get anybody coming to greet you, like maybe your host family and that's it, but we had kind of this whole party. And so we start kind of separating. I say my goodbyes to Oscar, and I'm starting to head out with my host family, and I think this is kind of when it started to hit me, because we went up this elevator to the second floor, we headed outside, and the weather was awful. It was a terrible day. It was super cloudy and rainy. And so my first view of Japan is stepping out of the airport, and I can barely see like 500 feet out because it's so rainy. And I'm just looking out at this, like, the airport is very far out from the main city. And so you can see kind of the coast of Osaka, but otherwise it's just rain and some cement buildings. And so I was like, this is kind of depressing, isn't it? As I was standing there, my host dad was getting the car, and it's this long car ride, like half an hour back to their house, kind of in the central part of the city. Mm-hmm. And, I talked with my host dad in the car. My host mom wasn't able to make it, so it was just me and my host dad. And, I'm able to kind of say some answers to his questions. We're conversing a little bit, even if it is a bit kind of rudimentary. And, I made it back, and it started to look more like my impression of like a normal country, I guess, having lived in America, as we got closer into the city. And we arrive at this house that's like super kind of, it's not wide, it's not long, but it's a very tall house. And I think if anybody goes to Japan or has lived in Japan, they'll understand that the houses in Japan aren't very wide, but they certainly do go up. There's only so much kind of land where people actually live and congregate. Because a lot of the country is kind of farmland or forest or mountain. And so, but either way, you end up with a lot of people squeezed in. And so in the bigger city, unless you're in a really kind of rather wealthy area, it's a lot of, kind of these tall houses with a lot of staircases and floors. And so that was kind of what my first house was like. As I walked in, there was just a little shoe area. We walk upstairs into the living room, and I meet their dog, who's wearing clothing, and I'm confused by that, which is something I ran into a lot. A lot of people that I had met in Japan had dogs that wore clothes. And I was like, wow, what an advanced culture. Because nobody does that in America. That's weird in America, usually.
Right. Well, celebrities do it. Some people do it for holidays.
It's like an upper class thing.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
So it's some of those small, it sounds like that's some of those small cultural nuances that you were starting to notice.
Yeah.
What other things have you noticed that were very different when you were in Japan?
I think when you go to a country like Japan that's very kind of modernized in the same way that, the West is, and I guess it's westernized in a lot of aspects. And so the culture shock doesn't hit you kind of like a truck, like it does in some countries. Like when we went to Senegal, it was a big shock, honestly, getting into the airport, and there's like a guard with a rifle, and I'm like, wow. In Japan, it's not like that. It's these small kind of, wow, that's weird moments that show up over and over. And so there was the dog clothing thing. The one thing that is kind of obvious but struck me in the way that people interact with each other was the bowing. Because, people do shake hands in Japan, like it happens occasionally. But usually it's a culture of bowing. And so you would see like a guy that was out at dinner with his boss or something, and his boss would get into a taxi, and the guy would bow to the car as it's kind of pulling away, and he would keep bowing and bowing as like he's looking at his boss through the window, and he bow and bow. It's kind of this repetitive motion, down up as his boss is leaving until he's out of sight. And to me, that's just such an odd way to say goodbye with how we do it in the US. In the US, it's like goodbye, and then they drive away.
Yeah.
But it's this kind of constant, I guess, attentiveness because you want to, let them know that you're, thankful or respectful or whatever it may be.
Yeah, respect is a lot more brought to the surface than let's say in the US. And yeah, that is a cultural thing because back home in Africa, in Senegal specifically, there's a gesture like that where if you meet an elder, someone who's older than you, or someone who is a spiritual leader or something like that, you would put your hand on your chest and then slightly kind of bow.
Yeah.
A little bit. Some people fully bow. So yeah, it's interesting to see those same cultural differences, but yeah, certainly not in the US.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a culture of respect at the kind of the core of it. Like any place you go to, it's not to say that there are no Japanese people that aren't like loud or something, but it's certainly, people really care about kind of respecting each other's space, each other's kind of environment, which, is people know that about Japan for a reason, internationally.
And while you were in Japan, you attended school.
I did.
As well. How was the experience in school?
I would say overall, a lot of exchange students expect school to always be fun, but it's not. It's not always fun. I'm going to say that right now. Because
why not?
Well, because there are still classes. And so I personally, with my Japanese, I didn't understand the vast majority of my classes, at least for the first kind of 4 or 5 months. And so a lot of it, when you're not between classes, it's just kind of sitting there in the lecture. And, Japan has a writing system similar to that of China's, where a lot of words just have their own unique characters. And so until you learn those, and it's about 2,000 to be on par with kind of, say, like an average high school student.
2,000 characters.
2,000 characters to memorize. And, by the time I was gone, I had memorized maybe 700. And so I was like 1/3 as literate as your average high school student. And so I could like barely read anything and barely do any work. So the actual class itself was frankly very boring. Even though I tried my best to pay attention and stay awake, which failed sometimes, succeeded other times.
And this was what kind of class? General classes?
Yeah, we had, everything you would expect from a high school class. They had, kind of chemistry and a math, which is funny because
math in Japanese.
Yeah, it was crazy because I don't think you realize how many math terms you don't know until you have to do it in another language.
Yeah,
like
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I know the numbers.
I had to do it in a couple different languages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like what's the word for square root in Japanese? And so like even simple questions you don't know how to answer. So yeah, math, chemistry, kind of. But yeah, a lot of normal classes. They had kind of a few, I guess, different ones that I wasn't used to. We had to pick for kind of an elective class between 3 options, and we had art, music, and calligraphy. And, being not Japanese, I was like, I've never done Japanese calligraphy, so I signed up for that. And it was this literally like 2-hour-long class. It was like a third or a fourth of the day. And we would just sit and kind of practice different calligraphy, and we had a book for it and everything. And it was, really, I guess not a valuable skill. Like I can't use it for anything in particular, but it was probably one of the most interesting classes I've ever taken.
And you had some interesting experiences in terms of at school.
Yeah.
How people perceived you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The people are definitely the biggest part of school on an exchange. Just on an exchange in general. Kind of getting to know natives and stuff. And so I had an interesting school in that my school was known for taking in exchange students. And so we had...
What was the school's name?
It was called Yuhigaoka.
Yuhigaoka.
Yeah. And we had, when I got there, maybe about, I guess at its peak, about 12 or 13 exchange students in the school. And so they kind of had us... we all kind of came in at the same time. We arrived in about August, and then we started school within like a week or two. And we had this school assembly, and kind of they had the whole school like sit down in the gymnasium and look up at the stage, and then they gathered all the exchange students, and they had us come up in front of the entire school and give like a hello, my name is blank, I'm from blank, you should know this about me. And so my first introduction to most of the students at the school was effectively just like an announcement, I guess, like of hello, I'm Noah, I'm from America, and I'm a cool guy. And so that happened. And I think over my exchange, the thing that surprised me was that I accidentally developed this reputation of being like the cool guy. Like We can't talk to that guy, cool guy.
That's funny.
And I don't know if it has anything to do with me being African American or just American in general. But yeah, a lot of people felt kind of nervous approaching me or talking to me, or they viewed me as like somebody they kind of, I guess, couldn't talk to, as in couldn't approach.
Right.
Which is crazy because, I tried my best to be friendly. But yeah, I just my exchange student friends would tell me a lot of the time, like, yeah, I was talking to my Japanese friends and they were saying like, man, that Noah guy is cool. I couldn't talk to him. And it's like, whoa, I never had this reputation in America. I've never been the cool guy. What happened?
Yeah, and appearance-wise, for those who can't see us, is Noah. He looks very friendly. He's lighter skinned, on the lighter skin side. Yeah. I am black, Senegalese, African American. My wife is Caucasian, white, Minnesotan, born and raised. Yeah. So Noah took on more of the lighter skin trait, but definitely African American identifiably.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's, and I was the only kind of black student there because we had all these exchange students, but they're from like Germany and kind of Denmark and China. And so there weren't exactly many black people there.
Right.
So I was, even among the exchange students, a little bit of an oddity, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess there were two dynamics. One was there were other foreign exchange students in that school.
Yeah.
So you formed a bond with them for being foreigners in another foreign country, even though you are all from different countries.
Yeah.
And then there was a dynamic of you dealing with the local Japanese students natively in the school.
Yeah, in a way, it was kind of like two different social lives a lot of the time because, some of my exchange student friends knew a few of my Japanese friends, but largely it was I was interacting with one group or the other, and not usually at the same time. And so. Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of exchange student friends, and frankly, native friends are a lot more difficult to make. I think, you'll notice if you become an exchange student, especially in high school, that a lot of people are intrigued by you being an exchange student. They're very kind of curious because you're not from there, and they want to kind of, talk to you at least once, kind of see what your deal is. In my experience in Japan in particular is that, a lot of people have that that kind of curiosity in the beginning, but then it kind of dies off. Like you become normal and then you have to find a reason to make people want to be your friend. You can't just ride the exchange student thing forever, which works in some places, but it didn't work for me in Japan.
Right. Because some programs are shorter, maybe 8 weeks, 12 weeks, but yours was a year, so you couldn't.
Yeah. So I was a permanent installation for that school year. So people just kind of get used to you, and you can totally use the I'm an exchange student, let's be friends card for a while, but it doesn't last forever.
A story that you told us was that part of your quote-unquote cool factor was due to the fact that you were late, which was accidental.
Yes.
Because can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I should mention at the announcement thing, the first kind of big orientation with all the students and the exchange students announcing themselves, I was late that day. They told me, come at a certain time, and I think I missed the train or something. And so
Yeah, you took the train from your host family's home to the school, the subway system in Japan.
Yeah, and this one isn't even a subway system. They have kind of an above ground system, and then they have a below ground system. So it's this whole thing. I went one station too far, and I had to, kind of get on another train, find my way back. And that caused me to be a little bit late. And so I arrived at the station as school was starting. And my school was about a 5-minute walk from the station. And so if I didn't want to be 5 minutes late, I was going to have to run. So I'm this like foreign kid in a Japanese school uniform, which is already a bit incongruous to local people. And I'm sprinting out of the station. I like hit my card as I'm leaving, and I'm sprinting down the streets, like past traffic. And I make it to the school after about a few minutes, but the assembly has already started. And so I come in to effectively a silent room besides the principal speaking. And hundreds of heads turn over to look at me as I open up the door.
And they're sitting all on the floor.
They're all like sitting in rows on the floor.
Right. And I saw the picture. It looks like a military school. Yeah. In a good way. They're really organized. The shoes are between the rows of students. They're all sitting on the floor, same position.
Yeah.
And you walk in.
And I walk in, the 6 foot tall, like lanky foreigner. And everybody looks over, and I'm out of breath because I sprinted to school. So it's this silent room, and I'm there like, and I line up with the rest of the students. So that wasn't the only time I was late to an assembly, and so I accidentally seemed like a bit of a juvenile delinquent some of the time, because I was just incompetent sometimes. Like we had this kind of school choir concert, and all of our classes practiced these songs, and we had to sing. And so my class got up on stage. I've been practicing with them. And, in Japan, even before the pandemic, it's pretty common to wear a mask. Like if you have a cold, or some people just wear it because they don't feel like doing makeup on their bottom half of their face or something. And I was wearing a mask just because I kind of felt like it that day. And, we got up on stage. I didn't notice my classmates all took off their masks as we got on stage. A few of them were wearing masks. They took it off. I was wearing a mask that day, and I didn't realize that I was supposed to take it off as we got on stage.
Right, and you wearing a mask had nothing to do with COVID-19.
No,
it hadn't happened yet.
Completely unrelated. So I was, it's my whole class lined up. Our hands are behind our backs as we're singing to the whole crowd of our grade. And I'm the only one wearing a mask. And so apparently the teachers were not cool with that. And I did not know because no one told me. And so everybody in my grade was like, wow, look at him. He's breaking the rules in front of the entire grade, in front of all the teachers. It's like, I'm not trying to.
When truly it's some of those cultural things that when you go to another country, another culture, those quote-unquote lost in translation things. You're doing things not intending to hurt someone or break the rules, but you're unintentionally breaking those rules regardless.
Totally. And no matter how careful you are, there are going to be rules you break. Absolutely. And, I think one of the most important things as especially a high school exchange student is that people aren't always going to tell you what's going on. You would like to think that you're the exchange student, so you're going to be walked through a lot of things. Oftentimes, you're just on your own. And so you absolutely, if you can, need to find a friend who's willing to stick by you and kind of let you know what's happening. Because I had a few of those, luckily. And they would help me out whenever I was confused. But otherwise, you're often just not going to know what's happening. And that can be, kind of with the concert example, like an infraction on kind of local authority or whatever it is. So
were these friends that were helping you out Japanese or other foreign?
Yeah, they were Japanese. There were some exchange students that had been there longer than I had, and so they kind of knew how the school worked. But generally speaking, yeah, it was like Japanese people in my class that kind of had a few of them had attached themselves to me to kind of help me out and walk me through things. So.
And while you were there, I know there were some rules by the Rotary, the program that sent you abroad, that you couldn't do certain things. You couldn't drive, you couldn't date, you couldn't obviously drink. So we don't, anyway, in our family, we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do any of that stuff. What are some of the things that you couldn't do, and how did that maybe hamper your ability to experience certain things?
Yeah, so I suppose it should be mentioned that, every exchange program has different rules. Probably the one that doesn't change being usually no driving and then no drinking or drugs. But Rotary does have, like you mentioned, like a no dating rule. And then they have, for a lot of people, a curfew. I had a curfew. Whether or not your host family is going to enforce it is, it depends on the family. But essentially all of my host families enforced the curfew. And so I was supposed to be back home before 9:30, which to me felt really stifling.
Yeah, because at home you had a curfew of midnight.
Yeah, I think midnight it was. Yeah. And so, I was never a fan of having a curfew. And so going from midnight, which sometimes I felt was like, why do I have to be home at midnight?
And our parents were like, yeah, because you have to have a curfew. Yeah. But then life taught you a lesson.
Yeah, to 9:30, I felt like I was, that was probably the rule that bothered me the most. I often felt like I was being treated like a child, where it's, I felt like I had come this far to this other side of the world, but I'm not allowed to walk around at night. Especially since Japan is, one of the safest countries in the world. So that was probably the only serious point of contention that I had between me and my host families and me and Rotary. I get why the rule is in place, but there are a lot of organizations that don't have that rule. And the no dating rule I didn't find particularly stifling. There were opportunities to get kind of romantically involved with people, but I knowing I would go home eventually, it didn't interest me really. So I avoided that on my own, but I could see why somebody would be bothered by that rule. Cause my parents met when my mom was on, foreign exchange in Senegal. And so, for me to be told like, well, your parents met on exchange, but you can't date on exchange felt odd because if my mom had followed that rule, I wouldn't have been born.
Yeah, I guess that's that. Yeah, that there's some truth to that. Yeah, since I met your mom that way, and we started dating, and later that led to us getting married. Now you ended up living in 3 different host families' homes.
Yep.
I know there was one thing that you found surprisingly interesting, which was the bidets.
Yes, the bidets. So, I was curious going to Japan because, you see all these jokes on sitcoms of like, whoa, this toilet has a bidet, and they freak out when it turns on or whatever. And like, I had read some Japanese people's opinions on the internet of like using toilet paper is barbaric. So I was like, well, I got to see what's going on. And, every house that I had been in had, at least one toilet with like a bidet function on it, or like, a fancy control panel. And most of them, they had that on more than one toilet. And yeah, I mean, it's cleaner for sure. And you don't waste as much toilet paper. That's like, I came back from Japan and I was like, we're buying one. We are getting one of these.
Yeah, we had to install one, but we'll have to upgrade that one anyway because it's not heated.
No, yeah. Well, heated seats were a thing. Automatic toilet seats that open up when you walk in the room. It's crazy. Right. They have mastered the bathroom.
Now, another thing I wanted to bring up was, of course, at some point during your stay, COVID happened.
Yep.
And that drastically changed your experience. What happened when you heard that COVID happened? How did that affect your experience in Japan?
So it started, I think probably December or January was when the first kind of news started coming out about it. I think that it was the same in the US as well, where it started spreading in China and people were wondering like, how serious is this? So from December to January, it was kind of just an object of curiosity. It hadn't really spread to other countries in any serious manner yet. It was probably around February where kind of cases started moving around and, we got a few in Japan and we were like, well, maybe this is serious. But nobody really was taking it seriously at the time. And I'm sure, the US and everything was the same way back in February. We had maybe a few cases in Japan. So we were just, going around kind of doing whatever. Some people were wearing masks more. Like I'd say towards the end of my exchange, maybe 50% of people were wearing masks like all the time. But 50% weren't. But yeah, I'd say until February, there were no effects on my exchange effectively. But then, in February, people kind of started wearing masks and there started being talk of like, maybe avoid going out or avoid like the trains at least, kind of crowded areas. And, quite honestly, most people weren't taking it seriously because nobody really thought that like an international pandemic of this scale was even possible. And so by the end of my exchange, because my exchange did end early because of COVID, I got sent home 3 months in advance. I was supposed to go home at the end of June. I went home halfway through March. By early March, pretty much my host parents were definitely avoid going out as much as possible. High school was actually canceled for the month of March in Japan.
Right, yeah, I recall that. Yeah.
Yep.
Which changed things for you because your primary way to connect and socialize was through the school.
Yeah. Which, was kind of tough as an exchange student because you definitely have established social connections. But just to not have that excuse to kind of meet up with people and talk to your friends every day it was tough. And, a lot of people like kind of staying at home when they're at home in their home country, but in your host country, it can get really, really boring. And even though you have a host family there, like there's really only so much you can do, so much talking you can do before you want to go out.
Yeah.
Even more so than kind of living at home in your home country. And so, yeah, I'd say towards the end of my exchange, it was pretty stifling, and it was, it got very difficult to kind of make social connections and meet up with the people I wanted to. But I'd say up until just about the very end, it was pretty normal. It was only in the last few weeks that it was like, I can't go out, I can't meet up with friends, I can't take the train or whatever. So,
now, did you have a chance to travel in the country and sightsee, and what was that like?
Yeah, I did a little bit of travel. I guess the most notable one was, for my host family at the time, did a Christmas trip to Hokkaido, which is the northernmost part of Japan. Japan is 4 islands largely. And so Hokkaido is the kind of the large, I don't know if it's the largest, but it's a big one up north. And so, it's known for, being super snowy all the time, having a lot of mountains for skiing and snowboarding and stuff. So we went on a skiing trip, which it was great. I mean, this happened back in December, so there was no COVID. We could just go to this resort and have fun. And yeah, we took a plane and flew over the mountains. It was beautiful. And we arrived at this, this kind of resort, like way into the Hokkaido countryside. And I guess the most interesting thing about that was that, Hokkaido is so famous for its kind of skiing and snowboarding that when you go to a ski resort or something up there, it's not mostly Japanese people. It's, people from all over the world come to these places to ski. And so when I got there, it was like this weird international safe haven where like, I met New Zealanders, Americans, Europeans, other Asians. And so like you would hear a million languages being spoken like at any place in the resort. And Hokkaido is beautiful. I mean, it's super mountainy, kind of like the rest of Japan. And we went in December, so it was at like peak snow. And it was incredible, honestly. Like I've only been skiing a few times in my life, and in Minnesota we have limited places to ski, and no mountains. So it was.
Yeah, you have to go to one of the local ski hills.
Yeah. And there's nothing like super. I can't like look off into the distance, and see a mountain reaching into the clouds or something like in Hokkaido. So it was, really, I guess, just impressive, really kind of mind blowing the stuff that they have up there. And yeah, so that was probably the main piece of travel that we did. We were there, I believe, 3 or 4 days.
Okay. All right. So we're running short on time, but that trip inspired you to consider going abroad and or even working somewhere, not necessarily Japan. What would you say to maybe other people who are considering going abroad? What would you tell them to maybe pay attention to or be more mindful of?
I would say, a lot of things that you may not find particularly bothersome could be very bothersome. And so to the people kind of there locally. And so I don't think the solution is to overanalyze everything you do. I think that only kind of slows you down and kind of lowers your own quality of life. But certainly, do your best to keep an eye on the reactions of people around you to what you're doing. I think Americans kind of have a reputation abroad for not really caring about what's around them and being loud and kind of all this. And I think just, I guess, do your best to avoid that stereotype. Be the person that looks around, then kind of watches people around you. Be the person that, in Japan, they say kuki o yomu, which means to read the air. And that's something we say in English too, but in Japan, it's like a cultural aspect. It's the ability to understand your environment and how you should be acting in it. So certainly, I think that's the biggest thing. Just make sure that, your actions are in accordance with your environment. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. Literally just do your best not to be a nuisance, and really the best that any of us can do as travelers. So.
And how welcoming were people?
They were very welcoming. I think a lot of people say that Japanese people tend to be cold or kind of unwelcoming. And I suppose that might be true in some places, like the business parts of Tokyo or whatever. But in my experience, people were, very welcoming, very excited that I showed an interest in their culture and in their language. I think people, internationally tend to appreciate that. Like we talk about culture in a different way in the West than people do abroad. I think in America especially, we have conversations about cultural appropriation and what is appropriate to, appreciate about another culture, what isn't, and all these different aspects. It's a very complicated dynamic in America. But I think generally when you go abroad, people just tend to be thankful that you're interested. Because, the world might be more interconnected than it's ever been. But the fact is that I can't just teleport to another country and experience it. It takes effort to go somewhere. It takes effort to look into it, to learn about it, to practice that stuff when you're there.
How did you get to be so wise?
I got it from my father.
Oh, well, thank you. Any final words before we wrap this up?
I guess at the end of the day, just don't take it too seriously. Really. I mean, especially if you're a high school or college exchange student, like you're never going to be able to get that time back. I have days where I kind of wish that I was back in Japan, and I'm sure I'll be able to go back eventually, but I'll never be back as an exchange student. So, wherever you travel, wherever you go at whatever age, just make sure to, enjoy it and just have fun. It sounds cliche, but just have fun. Do that thing that you're scared to do. Talk to that person you're scared to talk to. bring yourself out of your comfort zone.
Noah, thank you for finally sitting down with your old man.
Absolutely. You got me.
That was my interview with my son, Noah. I hope you found it useful. And if you are considering going abroad to live or to study, drop me a message and let me know where you are thinking about going. I would love to hear from you. I would love to know what you are planning on doing with your experience abroad. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast. It really helps people discover the show and benefit from the content that I share. You can find the show notes for this episode by going to my website at umarjeng.com/session 31. That's session 31. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I am grateful for your time and your attention. Until next time, please stay safe and motivated. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Motivational Voice Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and rate it on iTunes. Get show notes and the latest blog posts at omarjeng.com.